Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, was adamant about Methodist preachers getting together on a yearly basis, all in the same location for worship and connecting and training. And so thus began the tradition of annual conference. And for us, here in the California Pacific Annual Conference, our yearly gathering of clergy and laity is every June. And 2 sessions ago, in 2024, our theme for conference was Flourish. Now, one of the speakers who addressed us at that conference was Dr. Frank Rogers Jr. He is the professor of spiritual direction at Claremont School of Theology here in Southern California. And to be honest, I was not prepared for his message. It literally blew me away. It was entitled, Flourishing in the Midst of Trauma, Spiritual Resources for Healing and Recovery. And it wasn't a dry academic treatise filled with esoteric concepts and erudite language, not at all. It was a passionate and personal confession of his own journey and struggle with trauma and how God, over the decades, led him through healing. And I knew at that moment, this is a topic I need to address in a sermon series at our church. Welcome to a new 5-week series that I'm entitling Held, Finding God in the Hurt. Now, each week we're going to be looking at a different Bible story, and we're going to go beneath the surface to discover a traumatic experience that one or more of the main characters in that story went through. And I think as a church, we don't talk a lot about trauma, and there are a lot of stories in the Bible that connect, just as there are a lot of trauma stories in our lives. I'm grateful for the work of Dr. Serena Jones and her amazing book, Trauma and Grace, Theology in a Ruptured World. Dr. Jones acknowledges early on in her introduction that we live in a world that is profoundly broken by violence, and it's marred by the harms that we humans inflict upon one another. And yet at the same time, as people of faith, we believe that God loves this world, that God desires that the suffering that we experience be met with hope and love and grace. And she says it all comes down to this. How do people whose hearts and minds have been wounded by violence come to feel and know the redeeming power of God's grace? Because let's be honest, sometimes when you go through the wounds of life, you wonder, does God even care? Our first story in this series comes from the very first book of the Bible, Genesis. Now, it's important to know a little bit of the backstory before we dive into the story that we're focusing on today. Abram, or Abraham, was called by God along with his wife, Sarah. Actually, was originally known as Sarai. And God asked them to leave everything they've ever known, to travel to a location that I'll tell you when to stop, is basically what God said, and you will become the parents of a great nation. By the way, Abraham was 75 years old at this time, Sarah a spry young 65. Oh, and did I mention they were childless at this point? And they're supposed to be the parents of a great nation. Genesis chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar, and Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave, and gave her to her husband, Abram, as a wife. So 10 years have passed since God's first call upon Abram and Sarai. 10 years. Abram is now 85 and Sarai 75. Optimal childbearing age for a woman, don't you think? Yeah, that's exactly what Sarai thought as well. And so, growing impatient, she comes up with a plan to kind of help that whole parents of a great nation thing get started. Surrogate motherhood, right, with her Egyptian servant. Michael Williams, in his Storyteller's Companion to the Bible Commentary on Genesis, mentions that this was actually a pretty common practice for childless couples in many places in the ancient Near East. In order to secure an heir, surrogate wives were used in the same manner. There was nothing wrong with the plan itself in terms of its acceptability at that time period. Except, of course, it wasn't exactly what God had planned for them. So why did Abram go along with this, you ask? Well, Walter Brueggemann flatly declares it's evidence that Abram and Sarai were really struggling to believe the promise that God had made to them. Faith is not always easy. In fact, it often calls for persistence, which goes against common sense, especially when all evidence points against it. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. Now notice there's nothing in this story by the narrator to tell us how Hagar might have felt about all this. And as Sarai's slave, she could not have been more powerless. Kathleen O'Connor, in her Smith and Helwey's commentary on Genesis, notes that Hagar is of the lowest social status, therefore has control neither of her body nor of her life. And the narrator tells us nothing about how this arrangement felt in the heart and the spirit of Hagar. Now, of course, to be fair, Sarai was also in a very difficult position as well. For a woman to be barren and childless in the ancient Near East was not only a disgrace, for women back then were known primarily by their ability to bear children, preferably male children, but she also faced the possibility that no one would be able to support her in her old age, or shall we say older age. Verse 4, Abram went into Hagar and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Renowned 20th century author Nora Lofts, in her book, Women of the Old Testament, 20 Portraits, does a wonderful job of getting into the heart and mind of Hagar. She notes how Hagar would have spent her entire life at Sarah's beck and call, and now she's been able to do something that her mistress has never done. Prior to this, Sarah had everything and Hagar practically nothing. Now Hagar has the one thing that all ancient Near Eastern women desired above all else. It's no wonder that it changed the way she felt about herself, and others took notice. Now, the NRSV says that Hagar looked with contempt upon her mistress. Kathleen O'Connor, however, notes that the original Hebrew has sort of a less hateful translation. She says the verb may mean to treat lightly, which implies that Hagar no longer gave Sarai the proper honor that was due her position. But regardless, it's not surprising that Sarai is affronted, disturbed, and deeply jealous of Hagar. Verse 5, then Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, your slave is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. I love how Frederick Buechner describes this scene of the story in his book, Peculiar Treasures, A Biblical Who's Who. He says, as Sarah saw it, Hagar no longer walked around the house, she flounced. And whenever she had a craving for things like bagels and lox, naturally Abraham went out and got them for her. In no time at all, Sarah was livid with jealousy. Eager for peace at any price, Abraham said to go ahead and fire Hagar then, if that would make things better. And within a short time, Hagar was out on the street with all of her belongings piled around her, including the bassinet. Michael Williams notes that the word that Sarai uses when she confronts her husband, the NRSV translates it as the wrong done to me, it's often found in the Old Testament among prophets to describe the injustice and the wanton evils of a society that was going against the Lord. Kind of an interesting way of Sarai to approach this, because wasn't she the one that came up with this whole plan in the first place? In the ancient Near East, the maintenance of justice in a household was traditionally the man's job, so Sarai needs her husband's permission to do what she wants to Hagar, and he agrees. Now, according to biblical scholar Gerhard von Rad in his Old Testament library commentary on Genesis, he notes that what Abraham says here, she's your slave, do to her as you please, he's now severing his relationship with her as a wife. And she's no longer that second wife to Abram. She's being sent back to a lowly servant of Sarai. Sarai then chooses to deal harshly with her. This could be verbal, emotional, physical abuse, all of the above. We don't have any details about this, but it gets to be so overwhelming for Hagar that she chooses the only option she thinks she has left, and that's to run away, which, according to Kathleen O'Connor, says that probably meant death. But death must have seemed better for her than living through the hell she was going through. Hagar, a pregnant woman, alone in a hostile territory with little food, no shelter, and in danger of assault, she put herself in great peril. She runs away into the wilderness. But in the Old Testament, we often discover that the wilderness is the very place where people encounter God. In her book, Trauma and Grace, Serena Jones notes that the ancient Greek word for trauma means a wound or an injury inflicted upon the body by an act of violence. Now, to be traumatized is to be slashed or struck down by a hostile external force that threatens to destroy you. And although the Greek definition of trauma focuses primarily on physical wounds, contemporary trauma studies have extended its application to our minds and our emotions, and focuses on the violence that our vast interior worlds, our psyche, endure. And make no mistake about it, a wounded spirit is no less damaging than the more visible wounds that we may take on the outside of our bodies. Two of the leading clinical psychologists who have studied trauma, Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk, tell us that when we understand the anatomy of the original traumatic event, that can help throw light on the effects that it has in our lives. Here's how they characterize a traumatic event. A traumatic event is one in which a person or persons perceives themselves or others as threatened by an external force that seeks to annihilate them, and against which they are unable to resist, and which overwhelms their capacity to cope. So these are grounded in real events of some sort. It could be sexual abuse, a bombing, the loss of a hoped-for child, a close friend's death by suicide, the genocidal rampage of nationalism, a flood, car accidents, fire, death by handgun. It can go on and on. But did you also notice that this definition includes not just those who are the victims, but also nearby witnesses? Dr. Jones notes that violent events can befall both individuals and communities. Just think back to September 11th and how that impacted so many of us, even if we weren't physically there in New York. Traumatic events aren't necessarily limited to cataclysmic occurrences. They can also be repeated events of low intensity. But through it all, they outstrip our capacity to respond to and to cope with it. Verse 7, the angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. So as we suspected earlier, Hagar meets the Lord in the wilderness, and as in other places in the Old Testament, when the narrator mentions the angel of the Lord, it's often God himself coming in somewhat human form. Especially that appears to be the case when you hear the entity speaking as in the first person, as if on behalf of God. So it says the angel of the Lord, but it's really God. What's interesting is that even though God sees her plight, he actually sends her back to the very situation that had been causing her harm. Return to your mistress and submit to her. Micah Williams notes that the Hebrew can be translated, return to your superior and receive affliction under her power. Wow, that's shocking, isn't it? The verb here that's used to describe what Hagar can expect from Sarai is identical as the word used to describe what Sarai did to Hagar before she left in the first place. Nothing is going to change for Hagar, and that doesn't seem right. But like God's promise to Abram, God also has a promise for Hagar. I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And then in the verses that follow, God makes a few promises for her soon-to-be son, that's a soon-to-be-born son, Ishmael. In fact, Ishmael in Hebrew means God heard. And God says that his life will be wild and free. He'll often go a battle against his neighbors and brothers. As Von Rod puts it, this is a worthy son of a proud and rebellious mother. By the way, historians see Ishmael's descendants as being the Bedouins and eventually the origins of our Muslim brothers and sisters. Now, in the midst of this deeply painful experience in Hagar's life, when no one else seemed to bestow any kindness, any grace or understanding, she is held by God. And I think that is a powerful takeaway in this story, that when we're at our lowest points in life, when it seems that no one understands or cares about what it is we're going through, God is there. And God holds us tight. Verse 13, so she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi," for she said, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. El Roi in Hebrew means the God who sees. God alone in this story is the one who sees Hagar and her affliction. And it's an important gift to be given, right? To know that you have been seen for who you are and what you've been going through. This week I was reading a book by one of my clergy colleagues here in Southern California. The book is entitled Here by Reverend Lydia Sohn. And in her third chapter, she's talking about a time in her life when she was living for a short period in France. And she was part of the Taizé community there. And she had signed up to be on a week-long silent retreat. Right? No talking at all on her part, but there would be some talking to her. In fact, every morning at breakfast, there was a woman that gave a short Bible study. And she said this one particular morning, she was reading this story of Hagar. And she lifted up to the retreat participants the fact that Hagar gave God a new name in this encounter, El Roi. And she said, I now invite you to consider a name that you might want to give to God, a name that is personal to you and your relationship with the Lord. Now, I love it when I'm reading a book and it connects with the story that I'm preparing for on Sunday. And I thought, what a great question for us. I mean, especially after going through maybe a challenging or difficult season in our life, what name would you bestow upon God? And don't think of it as sacrilegious. Think of it as an opportunity to be a reflection of how God has met you and been a part of your life. Maybe not over your whole life, maybe just recently, what you've been going through. What name would you give the Lord? Well, Hagar returned to Abram and Sarai. She gave birth to a boy, just like God had said. The boy was named Ishmael. And by all accounts, he was loved deeply by his mother and his father. And as time passes, God renames Abram Abraham and Sarai Sarah. And lo and behold, along that pathway, miracle of miracles, after a visit to the gynecologist, Sarah discovers she's finally pregnant and gives birth in time to her own son, Isaac, just as God had said. Now, by the time we reach chapter 21, Isaac is about 3 years old. He's ready to be weaned. Chapter 21, verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. Now, the weaning of a child in ancient Israel was a family celebration. And in the Hebrew, the original Hebrew, it says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing, period. And then the ancient Greek Septuagint version of the Old Testament added the phrase, which wasn't in the original Hebrew, with her son Isaac. Michael Williams mentions how powerful that original Hebrew is if we just stop at laughing, right? It's important because the name of Sarah's son Isaac means son of laughter. It connects back to the time when God as an angel came to their tent and told Sarah that she would give birth, and she laughed at it, saying, how could I do it in such an old age? So Michael Williams thinks that when she hears Ishmael laughing, he wasn't laughing at them, he was just a kid that was laughing, that it reminded her that this older child of Abraham's could still cause problems for her son of laughter. And notice, through her choice of words, Sarah continues to demean and belittle Hagar, calling her this slave woman, refusing to speak either her or Ishmael's name. She doesn't even connect Abraham to their son Isaac. She doesn't call him our son Isaac. She says, my son Isaac. Sarah's bottom line is, both of them must go now. Verse 10, the matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. And of course, Abraham would have known the tension in the house between Hagar and Sarah and the boys, probably not between the boys with each other, but the boys and the other moms. He's trying to hold the family together despite these challenges, and now with Sarah's demand, it's come to a head, and he doesn't know what to do. Enter God. Verse 12, but God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is also your offspring. So God gives Abraham the go-ahead to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Now I can see how some of us might see this as God taking sides with Sarah, which is of course surprising given the way that Sarah has been relating to Hagar over the last few chapters. But on the other hand, notice that God is also making a commitment to Ishmael and his descendants. That God isn't just going with the elect lineage of Sarah and Abraham. There's a blessing for Abraham and Hagar's son as well. God's going to make things right for Ishmael. He will not be forgotten by the Lord. Verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And as she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. I mean, a loaf of bread and a skin of water, it's not a whole lot to send someone out into the wilderness, is it? I mean, off you go, have fun storming the wilderness. Again, no words are recorded as to what Abraham said, if anything, to Hagar. This woman who was the mother of his firstborn son, a woman who had shared one of the most intimate experiences two people can have. Verse 15, when the water and the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes, and then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, do not let me look on the death of this child. And as Hagar sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice, and she wept. I imagine that the promises that God had made to Hagar seemed like a distant memory because her current situation appeared hopeless to this desperate mom. She knows they are literally about to die. It's tearing her up inside. And Michael Williams says her pain should be the point of this story, or the focus at least. He writes, she is at this point of the story thoroughly innocent, completely undeserving of her oppression. Her tragedy is all the more powerful if we see her weep over the cruel fate of this child born from her body only at the direct request of Sarah and the eager involvement of Abraham. And yet when all seems lost in the book of Genesis, that's often when God makes another appearance. Verse 17, and God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." And then God opens her eyes and reveals a well that's nearby. She couldn't see it. She goes, she fills the skin that she has back up with water, and she and her son survive and thrive. And remember, the name Ishmael means God hears. Once again, God heard their cries and responds to these outsiders in Abraham's household. Verse 20, "And God was the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt." One of those verses that encapsulates a number of years that passed during that time, but it's a reminder that God's provisional hand was with Ishmael as he grew into be his own person, and eventually to start his own family, a family that would lead to a great nation of his own. Now, throughout this series, I'll be sharing short excerpts from Frank Rogers Jr.'s incredible book, Cradled in the Arms of Compassion. Now, let me just say up front, it's a very powerful but deeply disturbing book because it tells the horrors of the trauma that he endured. But it also talks about the healing grace of God that brought him out of some very dark places in his life. The book is not written chronologically. It jumps around through different ages. Chapter 1 starts out when Frank is 8 years old, and he recalls this story when he attended Catholic school. And early that day, he had been scolded by Sister Bernard, saying that he was daydreaming in class. In reality, he was stressing over the fact that his grandfather was coming to the house later today. His grandfather was the one who had been abusing Frank. On recess, he chooses to wander into the school's large chapel, a chapel that's able to hold 500 families. Huge. He writes this: "As soon as the door closed behind me, I was sealed off from the outside world. The looming sanctuary was silent, the cathedral quiet, palpable, and dark, so dark. The scattered candles before the statues up front stood out like stars glittering in the night sky. I stepped in cautiously only a few feet, and I sat in one of the pews near the back. I'd never been in the sanctuary alone before. I may well have been trespassing to be in such a holy place all by myself. Soft streaks of colored light drifted down from the stained glass windows along the side. The altar up front, draped by a purple cloth, held a cup and a plate. 2 spiked candles stood sentry on either side. Above, a life-size crucifix was suspended. The dead body of Jesus hung askew. His eyes, drained of life, were closed, but Mary's, however, were open. Behind the cross, perched at a height that could peer across creation, an ivory statue of the Madonna gazed out in maternal majesty. Her arms were outstretched, poised to embrace any who would weep into her shoulder. Her face was tender, sobered by the pain that all of us carry, yet all too content to companion us through it. And her eyes held it all, the death of her son on the cross hanging before her, the table that promised bread that would endure, the rows of pews still haunted by countless faithful longing for a place to feel safe and at home, and me sitting alone in the back. I cannot explain it, he says. I can only try to describe it. Staring into those eyes, I was cradled into love. She saw me. She saw all of me, my dread, my shame, my sorrow, my depletion, and she got it. I was no longer alone. I was no longer untouchably soiled. I was swaddled in a blanket of sacred care, as tender as a mother harboring her newborn. It was not cognitive, it was not thinking, it was not imaginative. I saw no visions. It was immediate, it was intuitive, it was visceral, it was more real than reality. I just knew. And whatever numinous phenomenon that goes by God was with me, as if Mary herself, clothed in an invisible presence, had come down from her perch, sat in my pew, and wrapped me in her embrace. So I let myself be wrapped. I just sank into a warmth, a peace, a security that I never knew existed. Mystics describe being absorbed into the divine as like a drop of water dissolving into an ocean of oneness. I wasn't dissolved. I was fully aware of what was happening. I was still me. However, I was fully enveloped in that ocean. That day, what lay behind, what lay ahead, even the sanctuary I was sitting in, it just all melted away. And until all that was left of me in this womb-like presence, soaking me from within and without, was a cosmic sea of compassion. And in that moment, in that eternity, embryonic as it was, I knew in my bones the birthright of every being that dwells in creation, that I was welcomed, I was known, and I was loved. With a love that was more pure than anything I ever dared dream possible. I'll stop there. Remember, it's the very start of Frank's book, a glimpse of grace. But it wasn't the end of his trauma, not at all. Nevertheless, I love the parallels between Frank's experience at age 8 and the experience of Hagar and Ishmael, El Roi, the God who sees. Maybe you have a different name for God. If not, I invite you to take 15, 20 minutes today and to think back of how God has been present in your life and to give that personal name to God. How has God held you in times of struggle and crisis? Now, I want to end with the end of Frederick Buechner's section about Hagar. He's such a funny writer. He says this: "The story of Hagar is the story of the terrible jealousy of Sarah and the singular ineffectuality of Abraham, and the way that Hagar, who knew how to roll with the punches, managed to survive them both. Above and beyond that, however, it's the story of how, in the midst of the whole unseemly affair, the Lord, half tipsy with compassion, went around making marvelous promises and loving everyone, creating great nations like the last of the big-time spenders, handing out $100 bills." Now, I recognize that this may be a very difficult series for some people, and if it's too much, if it's too triggering for you, I give you the permission to skip out of the sermons during the next month or so. Maybe email or call the church office. We can send you the text, and you can read it at your own pace. But it's my hope and my prayer that the series might just help some of us gain a new perspective on our past, painful though it may be. For we serve a God who knows us intimately, who loves us deeply, even in the midst of those most difficult moments. For it is in those times especially that we are held. Amen.